Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our May talk on our online seminar series for the Castle Studies Group. We are lucky enough to get two speakers for the price of one this month. We have Morvern from Historic Environment Scotland and Iain MacInnes from the University of the Highlands and Islands. And they have a fascinating talk lined up about a medieval siege. So I think that's plenty enough from me, and let's get on to the interesting bits about castles. So Iain and Morvern, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. I'll pick up first, but we'll be switching over the course of the session. So thank you all for coming tonight. I hope the talk is of interest. So on the 12th of July, 1336, King Edward III of England rode out of Perth with around 800 mounted knights and men-at-arms. They headed north along the modern E9 trunk road, approximately. Their day-to-day movements were recorded in a campaign newsletter written at the start of August and sent to Queen Philippa, presumably to allow the king to update his wife on his progress. And it's from this source that we find out that the king and his troops travelled over the next few days to Blair Athol Castle, quote, through the high and strong mountains of Scotland, into Badenoch, and then on to Ruthven Castle. From there, they continued north past Port of Garton and on to Lochindorb Castle, which was then being besieged by Bruce Scottish forces. Having successfully relieved the siege, the king and his troops proceeded northeast to Forres, Kinloss Abbey, and to Elgin. They then headed along the coast past Cullen, crossed the Devon, and avoiding Kildrummy Castle, headed to Aberdeen. The forces remained there for over 2 days before heading south through the Mearns, past Brechin and Forfar, before returning to Perth once more, just over 2 weeks after they had departed. Much discussion has focused on the purpose of this expedition, which includes suggestions of a strike at Bruce forces in the northeast, an attempt to retain momentum in a contested region of Scotland, an effort to build a chain of castles for control of the north, and an attempt to knock out Aberdeen as a landing point for French supplies and possible invasion. The point of today's talk will be, however, the very first action taken on this campaign, which is the relief of Lochindorb Castle. These events occurred during the period that has become known as the Second Scottish War of Independence, the war that commenced as renewed Bruce-Balliol civil conflict in 1332 and expanded to include Anglo-Scottish conflict from 1333, not finishing until around 1357. The invasion of Scotland in 1332 by a group of Scottish, Anglo-Scottish and English nobles, known collectively as the Disinherited, sparked renewed conflict in Scotland in the wake of King Robert I's death. Led by Edward Balliol, son of King John of Scotland, this group sought the restitution of lands and titles lost to them under the reign of Robert I for refusal to work with and active opposition of a king they saw as a murderous usurper. Early battlefield success at Duplin Moor near Perth in August 1332 led to Balliol being crowned King Edward of Scotland, but opposition by Scots loyal to the young King David II pushed the Disinherited out of the kingdom. They returned, however, in 1333, this time with active English support, led by King Edward III. Having won another large-scale battlefield success at Halidon Hill near Berwick-upon-Tweed in July, the Disinherited returned to reclaim their lands, and this time with greater success. Edward III also claimed his own prize for his assistance, which was the ceding of a swathe of southern Scottish sheriffdoms to be forever part of England, and that's the section there in dark red on the map. The Disinherited under King Edward of Scotland would rule what remained of the kingdom, and they went to work carving up what was left. Of particular note regarding such efforts are men like David Strathbogie, claimant to the earldom of Athol, and Henry Beaumont, claimant to the earldom of Buchan. They represented significant disinherited interests in the north and northeast of Scotland and sought direct succession to a large swathe of former common territory. The Second War of Independence is somewhat understudied and exists in the long shadow cast by the war that preceded it. The conflict is also one that may be seen more popularly as less successful and ultimately less heroic than the wars of Robert Bruce, but it remains an important period in Scottish history, not least because it was a war that largely resulted from the decisions of Robert I himself during his reign. It is also a conflict that gives the lie to the assumption that the First War of Independence was won by 1328 and that Robert I successfully settled and unified Scotland under his kingship. And the disinherited are proof of that, as they do appear to have made significant inroads in Scotland, based in part on their claims to ancestral familial loyalties within various regions of the kingdom. David Strathbogie appears to have been successful in this regard in his father's Athol earldom and in the Strathbogie lordship, but also in the lands of his grandfather, John Comyn of Badenoch, killed by Robert Bruce in Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries in 1306, in Badenoch and Lochaber. He may too have been able to act in the interests of his father-in-law in Buchan and in regards his uncle in Mar, and may also have had designs on the lordship of Strathan and territories in Murray and Ross. Strathbogie's promotion by the two Edwards as lieutenant for them in the north appears to reflect the power that he was able to wield in this area, as does the fact that when he surrendered briefly to the Bruce Scots in September 1334, he was rewarded with the exact same position for them as well. Strathbogie's efforts to control northern Scotland were, however, in late 1335, after he commenced the siege of Kildrummy Castle, which was defended by Christina Bruce, wife of the Bruce Guardian Andrew Murray. Bruce forces under Murray marched north and met Strathbogie in battle at Culblane in Mar, which resulted in a Bruce victory and the death of the Earl of Athol. Sometime after these events, the Bruce forces themselves invested Lochindorb Castle, the defence of which was led by Katherine Beaumont, Strathbogie's widow. And it was she who ultimately was rescued by Edward III's chevauchée into the Highlands. But relatively little is known about the Countess of Athol, her moment in the sun at Lochindorb apart. And so we've undertaken to try and find out a bit more about her. In particular, we focused on a re-examination of her experience at Lochindorb and the events around this siege as part of a larger study of her life more broadly. And this talk will provide some of the ideas we've been developing around the events at Lochindorb and Katherine Beaumont's active involvement in them to reconsider her importance within this period of Scottish history.
Thanks, Iain. So firstly, I'm going to outline Katherine's family background so we can get a sense of who she was. As you can see on the screen here down the bottom right, we've got Katherine Beaumont, and she was the daughter of Alice Comyn, Countess of Buchan, and Henry Beaumont, as Iain already mentioned. Katherine was born around 1315, so she was around 20 when the siege of Lochindorb occurred. Her mother Alice was the daughter of Alexander Comyn, the Sheriff of Aberdeen, and her grandfather was also Alexander Comyn, Earl of Buchan, from whom she inherited her part of the earldom. However, by 1310, Alice was living in England as part of the extended disinherited Comyn family in exile, and her title wasn't recognised in Scotland. Katherine's parents, as a side note, were the custodians of Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, who was Alice's aunt by marriage, and Isabella was the one who was imprisoned by Edward I for placing the crown or coronet on Robert Bruce's head at his inauguration, and she seems to have spent the rest of her life in their custody. In January 1327, Katherine's father, Henry, paid a fine of 1,000 marks to the English crown for the right to decide the marriage of David Strathbogie, the aforementioned Earl of Athol, then in the King's Ward as a minor. David's marriage to Henry's daughter Katherine is thought to have taken place around 1327 to 30. Strathbogie's parents had both died in 1326, so it's tempting to imagine that he lived in the Beaumont household until the marriage took place. This union joined together two prominent Anglo-Scottish families with interests in reclaiming forfeited estates in Scotland. David had been born in Newcastle in 1309, and like Katherine, he too had a common mother. So you can see David on the bottom left of the family tree. His mother was Joan Comyn, daughter, as Iain said, of John Comyn of Badenoch. His father was another David Strathbogie, 10th Earl of Athol. And Katherine and David had a common ancestor between them, William Comyn of Badenoch, Earl of Buchan, who died in 1233. And I think they were third cousins twice removed or something like that. So quite a distant relation, but still they both shared this common heritage. Common heritage. Marriage was a way for noble families to combine and augment their lands and their power and influence. So we see this match as a consolidation of this common inheritance. And Strathbogie has been described by Alistair Ross as, quote, the leading representative of the common family. Although this marriage took place before the renewal of war in Scotland, the situation must have already seemed precarious, because Robert I had only one legitimate male heir, the child David II, and Robert himself died in 1329. So as a descendant of John Comyn of Badenoch, Strathbogie might already have considered himself a natural leader of the political community in Scotland as war loomed over the horizon. This common connection remained important to Catherine throughout her life, and we can see that in her seal. We found two examples of Catherine's seal that survive, and they have the same design. And so you can see the seal on the right. It's not very clear, but yeah. So we have examples from 1341 to 2 and 1358 to 9. And the seal depicts an eagle displayed, so with its wings outstretched. And it's bearing the arms of, on our left, Strathbogie's coat of arms, and on our right is the arms of Henry Beaumont. Not only were her marital and paternal families important facets of Catherine's identity, but the eagle supporter itself was quite unusual in Scottish seals, and the Commons were among the few who adopted it. For example, it can be seen on the seals of Catherine's maternal grandfather, Alexander Comyn, which appears in the image on the left there, as well as Strathbogie's maternal grandfather, John Comyn of Badenoch. Rachel Davis has argued that seals functioned as both legal and autobiographical objects, and women used heraldry on their seals to communicate identities linked to multiple noble lineages. So the seal represents Catherine and David's shared common heritage, visually linking them together, and that heritage clearly remains important to her in the decades after her widowhood. If we see Strathbogie's campaign in the north of Scotland as an attempt to recreate common territorial dominance, not only his but also Catherine's common descent was clearly vital, and we can view them as a type of medieval power couple. They also had a son, inventively called David. So the son David is known as David V Strathbogie. And David V's birth date has been popularly recognised as being in 1332, but the evidence in the Inquisition's post-mortem for Strathbogie Senior point to a later birth date. The Inquisitions held in 1336 list the heir as 2 years old, and those held in 1337 list the heir as 3 years old, which would suggest a revised birth date of 1334. We've not found any proof of age inquest for David V when he inherited Strathbogie's lands, which is quite curious, because when noble children were born, the families often took steps to ensure that potential future jurors would remember the birth and the date of the birth. So, for example, they would record it in a chronicle, or they would have a lavish baptism ceremony and feasting and whatnot. The lack of English evidence for a proof of age inquest may be because in 1334, Catherine was here in Scotland and gave birth here as well. By the time of the 1337 Inquisitions, Catherine was back in England, so she could inform the local jurors of the age of her son. In 1336, when she was still up here, she could rely on the extended Athol kindred and retinue, some of which were based in Northumberland and Suffolk, which held their inquisitions in that year. So if Catherine gave birth in Scotland in 1334, this suggests that the disinherited position was considered relatively safe and secure, at least for a time. After their success at Halidon Hill in 1333, much of Scotland was divided up amongst them, as Iain mentioned, and only a few castles remained in Bruce hands. Edward Balliol made Strathbogie his lieutenant in the north, and Andrew Winton recorded that Strathbogie crossed the Month and spent a significant period of time in the lands of John Comyn. So he says that he spent time in the land that John Comyn had in hand, and there a wheel lang time dwelt he. So Strathbogie was settling himself into the lands of his grandfather in Badenoch and Lochaber, which are indicated on this map. His success in this region seems to have made the region safe enough for Catherine to join him there. And if Strathbogie was presenting himself as the heir of his grandfather, and this would have drawn on his common heritage, it may have been useful to have his wife with her own common ancestry on hand to strengthen that image. Also, since he was active in the war in Scotland in 32 and 33, the pair could only have conceived David V after Catherine's arrival in Scotland. If she arrived after Haldon Hill in July 33, the earliest birth date, assuming a normal pregnancy of around 9 months, would have been around May 34. And the Inquisition's postmortem for Buckinghamshire, which were held in 37, indicate that David V was 2 years old at the time of the feast of St. John the Baptist previously, which means the 24th of June 36, indicating that he was born on the 24th of June 34. Catherine's family, birth family, also appear to have been present in Scotland at this time. Her mother Alice, as well as some of her younger siblings, were at Dundar Castle on the Buchan coast when it was besieged late in 34. Henry Beaumont surrendered the fortress, quote, on condition of being saved harmless in life, limb, and all his goods, and being granted besides a safe and sure conduct to cross into England with his wife, children, and whole household. The presence of Catherine's mother and any female siblings, as well as family servants relatively nearby, would have been desirable to Catherine if she was pregnant around this time, since during pregnancy and childbirth, women were attended by other women in their circle. So where exactly might Catherine have been at this time? She might have given birth in one of Strathbogie's northern castles, including Blair, Inverlochy, Ruthven, Ray, or even Lochindorb itself, which is indicated the topmost red castle symbol on the map there. Normal practice for noblewomen suggests that Catherine would have attended Mass before retiring to her chambers around a month before the expected birth, and she remained in those chambers for at least a month afterwards before undergoing a purification ceremony at a nearby church. After the baptism of David V and Catherine's purification, there would have been feasting to celebrate. Her retinue of female friends, allies, and servants would have attended her during this time, keeping her fed, watered, and comfortable, saying prayers for a safe delivery, and assisting with the birth itself. These female household members were referenced by Winton, who wrote that at the time of the siege, Catherine resided in Lochindorb, quote, with other ladies that were lovely. They may have included some of Catherine's younger sisters, of which she had several, and those sisters might have been among Henry Beaumont's children at Dundar in late 34. In August of 34, Strathbogie travels from Perth to Lochindorb, perhaps indicating Catherine's location at that time. So it's only a couple of months after the suggested birth date. And even Lochindorb might have been the location where she gave birth 2 months before. However, she was not at Lochindorb at the time of the Battle of Culblane, at which Strathbogie was killed on the 30th of November 35, because when she petitioned Edward III for expenses that she had spent in defending Lochindorb, she stated that she had entered the castle on that same day, on the 30th of November. It's possible that she was present at Strathbogie's siege of Kildrummy, as it was not unusual for women to accompany their husbands on military campaign. Another example from medieval Scotland would be that of Mary of Gelders, who was at James II's siege of Roxburgh in 1460. If Catherine was at Kildrummy, it's possible that she left for the safety of Lochindorb when they heard about the imminent arrival of Andrew Murray and his forces to relieve the castle. In the siege of Lochindorb which followed, Catherine was likely accompanied by the young David V. According to John of Verdun's source, after Edward III relieved Lochindorb, he, quote, brought away the wife and the heir of David, Earl of Atholl. If this is correct, then the potential capture of David V or his mother Catherine may have been the motivation for Andrew Murray to besiege the castle in the first place, as that would allow him to take politically valuable hostages that he could then ransom. Protecting the young Atholl heir was a significant responsibility for Catherine. And although she did this successfully, it was not in any great level of comfort, unfortunately, since by the time she was relieved, quote, they did not have any straw or cloaks or anything else on which they could lie down or take their rest.
So turning to the siege of Lochindorb itself, the question is, why would Lochindorb have been chosen as a place of safety in the first place, after the siege of Kildrummy, and perhaps even for the birth of the Strathbogie heir? Of course, its island location in a loch provided a degree of natural protection, and the distance between the island and the nearest shoreline is around 283 metres. It's been suggested that the surrounding hilly landscape, now bare, may have had more woods in the medieval period, with the castle used as a hunting lodge. However, Mark Thacker has noted that peat-buried stumps of oak and fir may represent woodland communities which ceased to exist thousands of years ago, so the exact state of the landscape in Catherine's time is more unclear. The castle structure comprises a quadrangular enclosure, at least 2 stories tall, with round corner towers and subsidiary enclosures to the east and north, and the building occupies almost the entire island. The first phase of the castle is generally thought to have been built in the second half of the 13th century. As well as its defensive advantages, Lochindorb offered a degree of comfort. Anderson and Dixon describe it as, quote, a place of leisure as much as a place of defence, given the apparent emphasis on the provision of accommodation and hospitality spaces within the layout. Access was via an entrance in the east wall or by a possible harbour or landing stage on the north side, indicated by the remains of walls in the shallows. Lochindorb was held by the Commons by about 1302-3 when Strathbogie's grandfather, John Comyn of Badenoch, died there, and it was probably built for John's father. Alongside other common castles at Ruthven and Inverlochy, Lochindorb was part of a string of fortifications controlling access to and from northwest Scotland, and was on an important route from Badenoch and Lochaber in the west to Forres and Elgin in the northeast. With Robert I's forfeiture of the Commons, Lochindorb was granted Thomas Randolph, the new Earl of Murray, and later in the 14th century, Robert II granted the lordship of Badenoch, including Lochindorb, to his son Alexander, the eponymous Wolf of Badenoch, and it was later held by the Dunbar Earls of Murray and the Black Douglases, before being seized and partially destroyed on the orders of the Crown in 1458. As for the events of the siege, we have scattered details that can be pieced together to reconsider what happened. One element worth discussing is the question of whether a close siege was employed throughout. While a siege is often presumed to have commenced immediately following the Battle of Culblane, the chronology of events is confused by a series of truces and the negotiations for such, which took place before the battle and continued after it. Indeed, several sieges appear to have been launched in the aftermath of the victory, including one at Cooper in Fife, which may also have included some of the forces that had fought at Culblane. Moreover, members of the Bruce leadership, including Andrew Murray himself, who was present at both Culblane and Lochindorb, were involved in ongoing negotiations for an Anglo-Scottish truce, which commenced from at least the 17th of October 1335 and continued till at least the 8th of December. An added complication is the appearance of papal and French negotiators in England, who also engaged in negotiations, and which resulted in the existing truce being further extended to the 25th of December. This truce was meant to include the English and their adherents, as well as the Bruce Scots, and so it should indicate that truce conditions were meant to be in place across Scotland from mid-October until at least the end of the calendar year. That this was not the case, however, is made clear in chronicle evidence, which suggests that in November, Andrew Murray negotiated his withdrawal from the discussions with William Montague, Earl of Salisbury, which allowed him to ride north to relieve Kildrummie and confront David Strathbogie at Culblane. The fighting of the battle would indicate that a truce was not in place in northern Scotland at this time, although, as Nicholson argues, it was not in fact the Bruce Scots who had broken it, but rather David Strathbogie with his siege of Kildrummie in the first place. Indeed, Strathbogie appears to have been campaigning in the Scottish North before this date as well, and so it raises questions over whether a truce truly existed at all, or instead if it was perhaps meant to cover English-held Scotland only. If there were egregious breaches of the peace, however, Edward III appears to have ignored them, and he announced further truce extension, again at the instigation of the Pope and Philip VI of France, from the 25th of December to the 27th of January. And the Bruce Scots apparently could not deny that they knew of its existence, as record evidence shows a gift to the Englishman Stephen Mushops of 100 shillings for having escorted French and papal nuncios, quote, to parts of Scotland over the mountains, presumably to discuss the options for peace with Murray himself. Still, the king's negotiations may have continued in the absence of any knowledge that the Battle of Culblane had actually taken place. And indeed, he only appears to have started to respond to news of events in the Scottish North in late December. Even then, Edward III still continued his negotiations, possibly because he saw the chance of coming to a final agreement with the Bruce Scots. And these discussions did reach something of a positive end. Edward III announced on the 26th of January there would be a longer extension to the truce, this time until the 14th of April. And of note in this truce are two particular elements. Firstly, it was noted that anyone who broke the truce did so under pain of life and limb. And the suggestion here might be that this was specifically added by Edward III in the wake of Culblane and in an attempt to try and make sure that the Bruce Scots kept to their promises this time around. Secondly, and stated explicitly for the first time, was a clause that the truce was to include the Scots currently besieging the castles at Cooper and Lochindorb, and that the garrisons of those castles were to be left in peace until the truce should end. The specific inclusion of these sieges at this time might suggest that the Bruce Scots had ignored previous truces and continued their actions at these fortifications in the aftermath of Culblane. It may alternatively indicate that these were actually new events, or newly known events at least, which had commenced in between the periods of direct negotiation. That the same clauses were specifically restated in a further truce extension of the 18th of March to last until the 12th of May suggests at least that the English remained concerned throughout this period that the Bruce Scots would continue or recommence operations which the English perhaps could do little to oppose. Ultimately, these periods of truce ended around mid-May 1336, when English forces invaded Scotland once more, and the siege of Lochindorb, if it had ended as per the provisions discussed, presumably recommenced around the same time. A further additional complication is that chronicle sources and other evidence does not necessarily align with the dates of these negotiations. Chronicles suggest that the Lochindorb siege began directly after Culblane, and Katherine Beaumont's own statement that she entered the castle on the 30th of November and remained there until her rescue may also suggest as much. However, record evidence places Andrew Murray, who is inherently tied to the siege, at Huntly Castle, itself a Strathbogie fortress, on the 5th of December 1335, assigning the forfeited lands of Andrew Murray of Tullibardine to the Bruce loyalist Lawrence Preston. So if Lochindorb was besieged in the immediate aftermath of Culblane, it doesn't appear that Murray was leading it, or else he'd left others to oversee it. Otherwise, the siege did not, in fact, begin immediately after Culblane at all. And we know in part that this was the case because Bruce forces are noted spending at least a day besieging Lochindorb Castle in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Culblane, before the submission of Robert Mingus and others who had fled the disinherited defeat. And it appears likely, based in part on the Huntly evidence, that Murray and some at least of the Culblane army spent time in mopping up operations in Mar and Strathbogie, overturning the inroads made into the region by the Earl of Athol in the preceding months. English evidence provides the names of several Scots in receipt of English grants of money and food around the turn of the year, and these may be examples of Athol's supporters who had fled the region in the aftermath of Culblane and in the face of active Bruce operations in the region. The names of some of those involved and the lands that they held may also indicate Bruce incursions into Buchan and Banffshire around the same time. Considering the possible reach of Strathbogie's influence in the period before this, such efforts may have been essential and would align with Andrew Murray's campaigning in other years when Scottish territory was actively attacked in an effort to undo disinherited English campaigns and ensure, by force, that the loyalty of people on the ground remained with the Bruce Scots. This then may have been more pressing than besieging the isolated island fortress of Lochindorb and may have delayed action in its regard, although, again, the possibility of capturing Countess Katherine and her son may still have provided motivation for the Bruce Scots. So trying to sum up the start of the siege then, from the date at which Katherine stated she entered the castle, the 30th of November, to the activity being specifically included in the truce of the 26th of January, Countess Katherine and her garrison may have had to endure anything of up to 2 months of offensive Bruce action. The January truce did stipulate, however, that those within the castle should be allowed to depart and return without molestation. It also allowed them to purchase food to ensure their ongoing supply. And so this in turn prompts 2 questions. Firstly, if she could indeed leave at any point after the end of January, why did Countess Katherine remain at Lochindorb? And secondly, if the garrison was able to supply itself from the surrounding area up to the end of the truce on the 6th of May, then why was it starving when it was finally relieved by Edward III on the 15th of July? The second question may at least be answered by a particularly close Bruce siege in the 2 months following the truce's culmination in May, and the fact that gathering supplies over the winter months would have been no easy task for the garrison. Edward III's forces had sufficient problems living off the land when they were on campaign in the region this summer, and Lochindorb could not be supplied by English naval assets. Of course, both questions could also be answered with the simple reality that the Bruce Scots largely ignored the truce conditions as they related to Lochindorb. The capture of the important regional fortress, as well as Katherine and her son, may have been too important to allow the niceties of the truce to get in the way. And a sufficiently close siege should ensure that word did not get out to alert the English to the situation and indeed to the breaking of the truce. Except chronicle accounts suggest that that is exactly what happened, and that Countess Katherine was able to get word out when she wrote to Edward III and her father imploring them for rescue. So the closeness of the Bruce siege is debatable, and like the chronology of events, difficult to align with Katherine's own experience of matters throughout. What is clear is that Andrew Murray, closely associated with these events, was himself not at Lochindorb for the duration of the siege. As already indicated, he was elsewhere in December. He was likewise before July 1336 in response to the Balliol English invasion of the summer, when he and his forces lurked around Stirling in June, but were apparently driven off in a skirmish with Edward III's troops. Further evidence noted that Murray and his forces crossed the Forth sometime thereafter, presumably in their retreat north back towards Lochindorb. And such evidence reinforces the fact that much was occurring during this period of siege and that Bruce forces may not have been able to commit particularly large numbers of troops to it as an ongoing state of affairs. In such circumstances, then, it's easier to envisage the Countess managing to send a letter out. It also reinforces, however, that the Bruce siege may not have been as close as it might otherwise have been. And yet, in spite of this, Katherine may have chosen to stay in Lochindorb, perhaps as her safest option as she awaited rescue, or simply because of the young age of her son, which denied her easy freedom of movement.
Another reason for her remaining at Lochindorb, and indeed relating to the issues of supply that Iain noted, may relate to the weather. The 14th century was a period of significant climate change, and these upheavals shepherded in such crises as the Great Famine, the Black Death, and European panzootics. Scotland was no different, and although the evidence for Scotland is not so plentiful, environmental historians have sought to reconstruct the climatic condition of Scotland in this period. Comparative evidence shows that the British Isles more broadly was significantly affected in these years, including in the 1330s specifically. In Irish annals, for example, the winter of 1334-5 was said to have wiped out large numbers of fowl, and between 1335 and 36, there was significant periods of snowfall in Ireland, extending through the winter and long into the spring. And the winter was described by the Annals of Ulster as lasting from the first fortnight of winter until a part of the spring had commenced. Moreover, a great portion of the cattle of Ireland were lost in the snow, and the grass cornfields were destroyed in the same year. If similar conditions might have existed in the north of Scotland, then it might explain the difficulty that Catherine's garrison had in finding supplies and why they remained in Lochindorb during that time. Additionally, if the snow was as considerable as suggested in Ireland, then it presumably had a significant negative effect on both besiegers and besieged. Indeed, it begs the question of the extent to which a close siege could be prosecuted at all, and whether the Bruce Scots welcomed the addition of Lochindorb in the truce agreed in late January 36. As well as this, of course, is the possibility, if it was cold enough, that the loch itself could have frozen. That we lack any chivalric stories of besiegers and besieged skirmishing on the ice may suggest that this was not the case, or indeed that the siege was in abeyance during particularly bad periods of weather. But the possibility remains even if we don't have the evidence for it. And consideration of the climate at this time is an important element in gaining some measure of understanding of the conditions endured by Catherine and survived by her at Lochindorb, detail that's otherwise absent from the narrative and documentary record. This discussion then points to a suggested siege as follows. Some small effort of Bruce encirclement in December-January, but the siege was in abeyance from the end of January until the beginning of May. It's only from that point on that a more active siege of Lochindorb may have been possible. And as already indicated, encirclement may have been the best option for the Bruce Scots due to the castle's island location. This may be reinforced by Andrew Winton's chronicle account of events, which suggests that a small Bruce force was stationed at the loch site, while the main Bruce force, led latterly by Andrew Murray, was ensconced in the wood of Stroncailter, which is a location Geoffrey Barrow placed around 10 miles north of Lochindorb. The lochside force must have been sufficient enough for it, however, for the English newsletter to note that it could be seen from around 2 miles away. And it would have been these forces that are recorded skirmishing with English scouts, while presumably riders were sent from the lochside north to warn Murray of Edward III's arrival. Local legend speaks of a site, quote, on the southeast bank of the loch where the besiegers had encamped and worked their war engines to make a breach in the walls, which in the mid-19th century was still pointed out to tourists. Graham's Gazetteer of the late 19th century further noted, traces of the works are still to be seen on the point nearest the castle on the east side. And by a nice coincidence, this is the best place to park if you're going to visit as well. The location of the camp would appear to align with the site itself. This is the location closest to the castle, and so a short distance for siege engine fire. It's the location faced by the additional curtain wall, which may have existed by the time of the siege. It's also the side of the loch in which underwater investigation in 1993 discovered 5 stone balls, which may have been missiles fired from siege engines towards the castle. And the rough location of the balls is indicated in the circle on the left there. All of this suggests some quite concerted activity. Further local legend envisaged the Bruce Scots trying to dam the stream that entered the loch to flood the castle, perhaps the stream which currently flows out of the loch at its northern edge into Dorback Burn. According to this legend, the effort was defeated by a lone member of the garrison who rowed across the loch in a small wicker boat, boring through the planks that made up the dam and penetrating the construction in such a way that it instead flooded the besiegers' camp. This story appears, however, to have been copied from the events of the siege at Lochleven Castle in 1334 and transposed into the Lochindorb siege, although it's unclear if this was done in the 19th century or earlier. The comparison or confusion with the Lochleven siege may, however, provide some speculative evidence of how the siege of Lochindorb took place. For the siege at Lochleven, the besiegers used the cemetery of the parish church of Kinross as the location to build a siege castle, from which ambushes or attacks were made the time that they there abode. While the attempt to flood the castle may not be a comparable element, the establishment of a siege castle or fortalice may be relevant. While the medieval sources do not specifically mention such a construction at Lochindorb, referring only to a Scottish siege camp, the construction of these siege works remains a possibility, especially if a force was assigned to remain near or at the lochside to monitor the garrison, ensure that nobody escaped, and potentially launch attacks at and defend from counterattacks from the garrison of the castle.
So finally, we're just going to turn to how these events were depicted in narrative sources. English chronicle accounts offer a striking lack of detail about the siege of Lochindorb. This contrasts with the newsletter discussed at the outset, which was sent from Queen Philippa of England to the Chancellor, John Stratford, Archbishop of Canterbury, and dated the 3rd of August 1336, and presumably drawing on news sent from Edward III himself. The newsletter notes that Edward III rode north to Scotland at pace with a small force and reached Perth in a few days. He then rode through Badenoch to Lochindorb, chased off Andrew Murray and rescued Katherine Beaumont. He then proceeded into Murray, burned Forres and Elgin before heading to Aberdeen to spend 3 days on its destruction, before finally returning south to Perth. Yet the Lochindorb campaign appears to have made little impact on English chronicle narratives. And these can be grouped into several categories. So, for example, those in Group A largely ignore the campaigns of 1336 altogether. And the death of John of Eltham, the king's brother, is the only notable event for this year. Those in Group B note the king's rapid progress north to Perth with only a few troops, but indicate that no Scots would face him, and so he returned south. The groups in Chronicle C include Edward venturing into the Highlands, the burning of Elgin, and the destruction of Aberdeen, so they are more reflective of the detail that's provided in the newsletter. But no mention is made of Lochindorb, and neither of Katherine Beaumont. So thus far, we've only found 2 English chronicles that actually include the events at Lochindorb at all. Thomas Gray's Scala Chronica describes how Edward III, quote, rode over the mountains where he rescued the Countess of Athol, who was besieged in Lochindorb. Here, there was a serious shortage of supplies in his army for a time, but they were soon relieved by the raiding of Robert Ogle and other marchers. In this account, Katherine is most definitely rescued, and indeed from Lochindorb, which makes Gray something of a case apart in this regard. However, even he offers a curtailed version of events, eliding those in Murray and Aberdeenshire completely. The only other English account is the unpublished Northampton St Andrews Chronicle, and it most resembles the newsletter and notes the relief of Lochindorb in its narrative, but it singularly fails to mention Katherine at all or notes her rescue. And this contrasts with the Scottish Chronicle evidence by John of Fordun, Andrew of Winton, and Walter Bower, which all name her as key to the events in this year. So the question then is why Katherine seems to have been largely ignored by English sources, but emphasized in Scottish examples. It may have been simple medieval misogyny, with the deliberate omission of her and her efforts to hold Lochindorb so as not to overshadow Edward's victorious campaign in the north. It may also be because events in Scotland by the time these chronicles were being written were more turning towards victories in France, and chroniclers may have been more inclined to write about them than events in Scotland. In comparison, Scottish chroniclers were perhaps keen to draw attention to Andrew Murray's last-minute escape and his denial of battlefield victory to Edward III, events around which it may have been difficult to omit Katherine's involvement. Additionally, the tale provides a nice parallel to Andrew Murray's rescue of his own besieged wife, Christina Bruce, at Kildrummy the previous year, and so Scottish writers may have included it for the literary neatness it brought to their narrative. But it's also possible that English reticence over this event was based on concerns over Edward III's reputation. Chroniclers may have been aware of stories, likely French propaganda, first written by Jean le Bel, circulating about the king and his supposed rape of the Countess of Salisbury. Antonia Granson describes La Belle creating, quote, a subtle and insidious composition calculated to deceive because it was set in the context of well-known events. Granson dates this creation to the early 1340s, but La Belle may have based his tale on earlier works in the popular domain and known to contemporary chroniclers. We certainly know of other tales created to besmirch the reputation of Edward III in the same period, such as the Scottish accusation that he had slain his own brother, John of Eltham, at the church altar in Perth, also in 1336. So it's possible that there were other similar tales in circulation at the time, which in this case cast aspersions on Edward's rescue of Catherine, perhaps with the addition of salacious tales of sexual misconduct, and which resulted in her deliberate removal from English chronicles. Indeed, further on this point, Jean Le Belle's account of events preceding the rape of the Countess of Salisbury appear to mirror those at Lochindorb quite closely. So in Le Belle's narrative, an English countess is besieged by the Scots in northern parts, although in his account it's in northern England at Wark Castle. The countess sends word to the English king of her plight, and he undertakes her rescue. He rides north at pace, but the Scots retreat before him rather than facing him. And at the king's arrival, the countess comes out to meet the king and gives her thanks. This narrative is eerily similar to the events of the Lochindorb campaign, and they appear to combine elements from the various sources of events, such as the rapidity of the king's ride north, discussed in detail in the Group B English Chronicles, the message sent for help, which is discussed by the Scottish writers Forden and Bower, as well as the Scottish retreat detailed in the newsletter, in Winton, and in the various forms of English chronicles. The fourth point of the Countess coming out to meet the king on his arrival aligns with the English newsletter's account of events, in which it describes how, quote, the said Countess, steering a small boat to the land, repeatedly thanked our said lord, expounding fully on the deprivation and adversity suffered by her and hers, and that for everyone in the castle there no longer remained any victuals except for one cask of wine of little or no worth and 2 bushels of grain, and they did not have any straw or cloaks or anything else on which they could lie down or take their rest. The final point of comparison between Le Belle's events and the Lochindorb siege is the Countess of Salisbury herself. Although named Alice in Le Belle's account, the actual Countess of Salisbury at this time was in reality named Catherine, as she was Catherine Grandison. Le Belle located the Countess of Salisbury episode in the 1340s to align with Edward's activities in northern England at this time, but he may have based his tale on earlier works in the popular domain. If, as Granson suggests, Le Belle's account is based on, quote, some now lost tract or even a poem aimed at discrediting Edward III, it's tempting to suggest that the first part of his narrative, at least, is based on the events at Lochindorb. If this provides some explanation as to English reticence to discuss the campaign, then it may also suggest why Scottish sources were so keen to make far more of it, and indeed of Catherine directly in their narratives. While not repeating the explicit details of vulgar tales about Edward, allusion to the events may have been sufficient for audiences to know exactly to what the Count referred. In an environment in which popular ribaldry as anti-English propaganda was common, it is possible that popular ballads existed which emphasized a sexual motivation for Edward's rescue of Catherine, to which Scottish chronicles made guarded but still clear reference, and which may explain why English sources were reticent to relate the story at all.
To conclude then, Katherine Beaumont remains a somewhat enigmatic historical figure, in large part due to the scarcity of surviving contemporary evidence. However, by focusing on a specific event, namely the Siege of Lochindorb, we can get a better feel for the significant role that she played at this time. She was a wife, a mother, and then a widow, thrown into the heart of Bruce Balliol civil conflict and required to take on the role of leading the defence of the castle to defend her son and his rights. Looking at her story in Scotland more broadly, we can see her importance in the disinherited war effort, and that she was considered an important figure by both her allies and by her enemies. Turning to Lochindorb itself, the castle also played a significant role. As a common residence, it was an obvious symbol of the return of 2 individuals, David Strathbogie and Katherine Beaumont, who claimed the common inheritance, and could appeal to those in the regions in which they operated who still retained some loyalty to that kin group. It's also the possible location where Catherine gave birth to the disinherited Athol heir, and it was a target for capture by Andrew Murray, the Guardian of Scotland, and for the Bruce Scots more generally. The location and the wider landscape of the castle and surrounding territory, as well as areas such as climate history, have much to tell us about the obstacles that Catherine faced in defending Lochindorb. And this is an area we'd like to develop in future work. So too is the life and career of Catherine herself in the years after the siege. For having been a young woman during the events of 1335 to 6, and at the time of her widowhood, she lived for a further 32 years, all of which was apparently spent on her husband's estates in Kent. She never remarried, and evidence exists of several years of litigation to defend the landed rights of her and her son, as well as complaints to Edward III for financial support in her widowhood and support of her child. This all points to a far more interesting history for Katherine Beaumont than currently exists. What we've suggested is that although her time in Scotland was fairly brief, her place in Scottish history was far more important than the medieval sources may at first suggest. Thank you for listening.